Hey everyone, how's your day going? Whether it's been good or rough, you're not alone. So sit back, relax, and let's step into the world of mystery together. The annual autumn carnival had rolled into town again, filling the air with the scent of fried dough, the sound of laughter, and the glow of multicolored lights strung across booths and rides. It was a beloved tradition, despite the whispered rumors, stories of people who had vanished without a trace, of rides that seemed to move on their own. No one took them seriously. A carnival was just a carnival, right? I was there with my best friends, Brian and Ann, eager to escape the monotony of small-town life for one thrilling night. We weaved through the crowd, dodging costumed performers and game hawkers, drawn toward the towering Ferris wheel at the edge of the fairgrounds. Let's start with this, Ann suggested, pointing at the Ferris wheel. Its flashing bulbs flickered erratically against the darkening sky. Brian hesitated. I don't trust those things. What if the bolts aren't secure? What if the guy running it hasn't slept in 2 days? I grinned. Live a little, Brian. What's the worst that could happen? After some coaxing, we climbed into one of the metal cars. As the wheel lifted us into the air, I leaned over and spotted something odd, a carousel set apart from the rest of the attractions, hidden behind a copse of trees. Its lights glowed faintly, flickering like dying candles. That's our next stop, I announced, and squinted. I don't remember seeing that before. Maybe it's an old ride they're bringing back? I suggested. Either way, I want to check it out. The Ferris wheel creaked to a halt, and as soon as we stepped off, I led the way toward the secluded carousel. The closer we got, the more wrong it felt. The paint on the horses was chipped, revealing rusted metal beneath. Some of the creatures weren't even horses. There was a wolf with a twisted snarl, a skeletal deer, a lion whose jaw gaped too wide. The center column was adorned with faded portraits of clowns, their painted smiles too sharp, too knowing. This thing looks haunted, and muttered. Brian took a step back. We shouldn't be here. I rolled my eyes. It's just a ride. Before they could protest, I hopped onto a palomino horse. The moment I settled onto the saddle, the carousel came to life. The lights flared, flooding the clearing with an unnatural glow. The music started, warped and out of tune, like an ancient calliope on its last breath. The platform beneath me trembled and began to spin. At first, it was exhilarating, but then it didn't stop. The speed increased, the music twisting into something manic. I tried to move my arms, my legs, but they felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on me. From the corner of my eye, I saw the figures in the mural moving. One turned its head toward me. I gasped and looked away. When I glanced back, they were still. The carousel spun faster. Brian and Em blurred in the distance. The wind roared past my ears. My lips stretched into a grin that wasn't mine. Then something grabbed me. I felt hands, cold, bony fingers wrapping around my arms. The painted figures weren't just shifting, they were reaching for me. Ann and Brian stood frozen at the edge, watching in horror. Suddenly, something warm and wet splattered across Ann's face. She wiped at it, looked down. Blood. Brian screamed as my arm, was flung onto the ground in front of him. And then, the carousel slowed. The music wound down, the lights dimming. The ride creaked to a stop. There was no trace of me. Blood stained the rusted poles. The clown's painted lips gleamed red. The air smelled of metal and decay. The carousel was silent. And then they saw me. I was part of the ride now. My contorted body had been fused into the carousel's structure. My eyes, wide and frozen in horror, peered out from the metal frame. My mouth, locked in an unnatural grin, would never scream again. The carousel had claimed another soul. Brian and Ann ran for help, but when they returned, the blood was gone. The carousel stood still, lifeless, as if nothing had ever happened. And me? I was erased from their memories. The carnival packed up days later, only to return the next year. No one remembered the boy who disappeared. No one asked about the forgotten carousel nestled behind the trees. But it was still there, and it was waiting. Maybe the real horror isn't just in ghosts or curses, but in how easily people forget the horrors that lurk in plain sight. Every year, the carnival comes back, and every year, people flock to it, blind to its dark history. So, if you ever come across an old ride, one that seems too hidden, too empty, walk away. Because some rides don't just take tickets. They take people. I never wanted to move back to Kentucky. But after my mom passed away, I packed up my things, put my son Tyler in the car, and drove through the winding roads of the Appalachian Mountains, heading back to the house I grew up in. There was something eerie about returning after all these years. The dense forests, the long stretches of empty road, the houses that looked abandoned but weren't, it all reminded me of the stories we used to tell as kids. And none scared me more than the legend of Sprinkles, the killer clown. Back in 1973, a caravan of circus performers crashed along an icy mountain road. The wreckage wasn't found for days, and when rescuers finally arrived, they discovered something horrifying. Of the 5 clowns who had survived the crash, only 3 were still alive. They told police a clown named Sprinkles, a stranger who wasn't part of their group, had emerged from the woods after the accident and held them hostage, forcing them to eat the flesh of the dead performers. If they refused, he promised they'd be next. One of them managed to break free and get help, but by the time authorities arrived, Sprinkles had disappeared. Over the years, people claimed to see a clown in the woods captured on trail cams, glimpsed by hikers. He was never caught. Some said he was long dead. Others believed he was still out there, waiting. That story had terrified me as a kid. And now, decades later, as I drove through my old town, I was snapped back to reality by the sound of a warbling jingle in the distance. An ice cream truck. Tyler's face lit up. "Dad, can we get one?" We pulled over, and under the glow of a flickering street lamp, the ice cream truck sat idle, playing its eerie tune. Then the driver stepped out. A clown. My gut twisted. He was tall, dressed in a faded striped uniform. His makeup was cracked, and his painted smile was too wide, too sharp. His yellowed eyes locked onto Tyler, and for a second, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Chocolate with sprinkles," Tyler said, grinning. The clown chuckled, reaching into the freezer. "Great choice, kid." I pulled out my wallet, but he waved a gloved hand. "No charge today. Just delicious ice cream." I stiffened. The next evening, around the same time, I heard the same off-key jingle. I stepped outside. The ice cream truck was parked just a few houses down. I went with Tyler again, watching more closely this time. The clown's uniform looked even more worn out than before. The colors seemed to be fading, and yet the ice cream was always fresh. $3.50 today, the clown said, handing Tyler another cone. I frowned. Yesterday was free. That was just for new customers, the clown chuckled. Something about him unsettled me. Every night after that, the truck returned. And every night, Tyler was the first one out the door. At first, I told myself I was overreacting, that I was being paranoid. But then I started noticing strange things. The truck never parked in the same place twice. The clown's uniform seemed to change slightly every day, as if it were falling apart. And Tyler, he was becoming obsessed. One night, I found him sitting by the window watching. "Tyler?" I whispered. He didn't look away. He said he'll see me soon. A cold dread settled in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, flipping through TV channels, when a breaking news report caught my attention. Authorities confirmed they have arrested a suspect responsible for the recent child abductions in the area. Witnesses say the perpetrator was disguising himself as an ice cream vendor. My heart stopped. A photo of the suspect flashed on the screen. And it wasn't the clown from the truck. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. If the real kidnapper was caught, then who had been visiting my son? I ran to the door, flinging it open just as the familiar jingle played down the street. Tyler was already outside. "Tyler, get away from him!" I shouted, sprinting toward the truck. The clown dropped the ice cream and lunged backward, but I tackled him, driving my car keys into his eye. He let out a guttural, distorted scream. Blood gushed from the wound, but something about it was off. His voice didn't sound human. It was high-pitched and warbled like a record skipping. Tyler screamed. We ran inside, locking the door. My hands were shaking as I turned up the news, expecting to hear that the real Sprinkles had finally been caught. But instead, the anchor said, "The suspect is now in custody, and police confirmed there are no other perpetrators at large." I froze. That wasn't possible. I had just attacked someone who wasn't the real kidnapper. I turned to Tyler. He looked terrified, but his fear wasn't directed outside anymore. It was directed at me. Had I let the legend of Sprinkles consume me? Had I let paranoia turn me into something monstrous? I looked outside. The truck was gone. No blood. No struggle. Just an overturned cone melting into the pavement. And then, in the distance, I heard the faintest whisper of laughter. I held Tyler close. Because now, I wasn't sure if Sprinkles was just a story. Or if he was still out there, watching. And for the first time, I had to ask myself, who was the real monster here? Fear is a powerful thing. It warps reality, makes us see danger where there is none. It can turn even the most rational people into monsters. Maybe Sprinkles was never real. Or maybe he was. And maybe I had just attacked the wrong clown. So the next time you hear an ice cream truck's jingle echoing through the night, take a second to really listen. because you never know who's behind the wheel. I have always had a fascination with words, poetry, myths, lost literature, stories that held a weight, a power beyond what people could understand. Some words create, some words destroy, and some should never be spoken aloud. I learned that the hard way. It started with a book. It wasn't supposed to be there, tucked between well-worn poetry anthologies in the dimly lit corner of the library. Its leather cover was cracked with age, its pages thin and yellowed. The title was embossed in faded gold. Sakin, Cursed Verses of the Past. I flipped through it idly until a particular poem caught my eye. Tomino's Hell. A jolt of familiarity ran through me. I had heard whispers about it before. An urban legend buried in the depths of internet forums. They said reading it out loud could bring horrific misfortune. Sickness, madness, even death. It sounded ridiculous. Just another spooky internet hoax. But as I ran my fingers over the words, a strange heaviness settled in my chest. Elder sister vomits blood. Younger sister breathes fire, while sweet little Tomino just spits up the jewels. I stared at the lines, unease creeping up my spine. The air around me felt different, the overhead light flickering slightly. I glanced toward the library's front desk. The librarian, an older woman with sharp eyes, was watching me. When I made eye contact, she immediately looked away, her mouth pressing into a firm line. Then, as if making a decision, she stood up and hurried toward me. "You need to put that book back," she said in a low voice. I frowned. "It's just poetry." Her expression darkened. "If you value your life, do not read it aloud." That should have been my first warning. But instead, I tucked the book into my bag and checked it out. That night was open mic night at the cafe where I worked. I had planned on reading one of my own pieces, but at the last minute, I felt a strange pull toward the forbidden poem. The words on the page seemed to demand attention. It was raw, eerie, powerful, exactly what I had been looking for. The legend was just a myth, a story meant to scare people. So I walked onto the small stage, adjusted the microphone, and began to read. The first verse passed my lips. Immediately, the air in the cafe thickened, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. The soft hum of conversation went silent. The faint scent of coffee turned sharp, metallic, like rust, like blood. My mouth went dry. My hands trembled. Something was wrong. I forced myself to keep reading. As I spoke the second verse, the cafe lights flickered violently, casting jagged shadows against the walls. I could hear it, whispers slipping through the air, voices layered upon each other. I wasn't alone anymore. And then, the lights went out. Gasps erupted in the darkness. I stood frozen on stage, heart hammering, ears straining. And then, from the far corner of the cafe, I heard it. A wet, rasping breath. And a whisper. "You called my name." I couldn't move. The air was too thick, pressing against my lungs. My vision swam, the darkness closing in. Then suddenly, the lights snapped back on. A dozen people were staring at me. Some had palms clamped over their mouths, their faces pale. Others looked at my arms, eyes wide with horror. I followed their gaze and nearly screamed. The words of the poem were etched into my skin. Dark letters burned into my flesh as if they had been carved from the inside out. The room tilted. My stomach lurched, and then I collapsed. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. My head throbbed. My body felt like it had been set on fire. Frantically, I yanked up my sleeves, expecting to see the dark, burned in words. But my skin was clean. Had it all been a hallucination? Then, from the corner of my room, I heard a soft cough. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head. A small figure was crouched in the shadows. A boy. His body was thin and sickly, his skin pale as death. His wide, black eyes stared into mine, unblinking. Blood dribbled from his lips as he whispered, "You read my poem. Now you must finish it." I ran. I don't remember grabbing my keys, don't remember slamming the door behind me. I just remember running into the cold, night air, heart thundering in my chest. But the whispers followed me, in the rustling leaves, in the humming streetlights, in the garbled voices of my voicemail. Tomino was everywhere, and the worst part, the final verse of the poem was missing. I had summoned someone, and now I was unfinished business. I don't know how long I have left, but if you ever see a poem called Tomino's Hell, do not read it, because some words aren't just poetry. Some names aren't just names. And if you say them, be prepared to answer when they call back. Superstitions exist for a reason. Maybe they're just stories, but maybe, just maybe, some warnings are meant to be taken seriously. Tomino's poem isn't just folklore. It's a door, and somewhere, even now, he is still waiting. So if you ever see that poem, turn the page. And whatever you do, never read it aloud.